Hey guys, and welcome to part 2 of 10 Chinese Stereotypes Explained. In the last video, we talked about some characteristic stereotypes, and in this video, we're going to focus more on society and cultural stereotypes that others may have of Chinese people. So before we get started, I will once again show you my disclaimer because I don't want people to yell at me. If you want to read that, you can pause the video right now. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started with the video. 我们开始吧。Stereotype number 6. Chinese people are cheap. Did you know that Chinese people will reuse their plastic shopping bags, take all the free toiletries from hotels, and only eat king crab at all-you-can-eat buffets? These are some of the stereotypes that people have of Chinese people, and to be honest, my family may have been guilty of all of them. To understand the stereotype, you have to realize that it basically only applies to one generation of Chinese people, the generation who grew up during or for a while after the Chinese Civil War. You see, after the Communist Party took control of China, China was very poor and in turmoil for quite some time. From the Great Leap Forward, which ended in the greatest man-made famine in history, to the Cultural Revolution, which destroyed traditional values and intellect and further plummeted China into extreme poverty. At that time, resources were very scarce, and the communist ideology got so extreme at some points that having personal wealth was basically a crime, and you would get punished for it. So the people who grew up in this era, or for a while after, like my parents did, became very sensitive to protecting their personal wealth and making the most of any resources they have available. So next time you see a Chinese auntie being skimpy, just remember what you learned today before judging. Stereotype number 7. Chinese people love name brands. Wait a minute, didn't you just say Chinese people are cheap? What is this? Well, this stereotype applies to a different group of Chinese people, the international students. In China, they're called the Fu二代, or second generation rich. After the 30 years of turmoil, all the catastrophe that I just described, China finally found economic success in 1978 when Deng Xiaoping introduced a series of economic reforms that opened up China to international trade and also, more importantly, private ventures. What happened next was considered a miracle by many economists. China's economy boomed, and the first generation of people who took advantage of those reforms got rich. Filthy rich. Their children became the first generation in modern China to be born into an upper-class, luxurious lifestyle. And remember that this was during the one-child-per-family era, so oftentimes these children were a bit spoiled and given whatever they wanted. Since Western schools are often seen as more prestigious, many Chinese parents will send their kids abroad to study, where they're often given unfathomable amounts of money to spend as they desire. If you've been to any US college campus, you've probably run into these students before. Yes, the ones with their $1,000 Supreme jackets, $2,000 Gucci handbags, driving around in a $50,000 BMW, enough to make any middle-class American drool with envy. So this stereotype is kind of true for that particular group of Chinese people, and the number of rich Chinese students does in fact surpass rich international students from other countries. You can search the web and there's literally hundreds of articles about how important these Chinese international students are to these luxury brands and how these companies are specifically targeting Chinese international students. It's kind of hilarious, actually. But keep in mind that not all international students are Fu二代. Many Fu二代do choose to study abroad, or their parents choose for them to study abroad, but a lot of international students, I should say most international students, are relatively average people coming from relatively average families. I personally have 2 friends who are international students, and neither of them are rich. They're both just average students, working hard on their studies and driving around in their Toyotas, not like the crazy lifestyle that I described. It's just that the elite few who are crazy rich leave such an impression on people that people start to think that,
oh, all these overseas Chinese are like loaded with money.
I mean, imagine you're like a first-year college student from small town America, and the first week of school you see like this Asian dude just drive to campus casually in an Aston Martin, and you're not going to forget that easily. Stereotype number 8. Chinese people are bad drivers. And speaking of driving, I've heard over and over in my life that Chinese people are bad drivers. Well, this is simply not true. Like, Have you been to China before? It's home to literally some of the best drivers in the world. The first time I went back to China and I rode in somebody's car, I was like low-key freaked out because he was like pulling all these like tight and aggressive maneuvers to like get around people, and everybody drives like that and somehow nobody hits each other. Like in the US, if you drove like that, there'd be like 4 accidents and he'd have like 20 citations.
Gotcha.
I think this stereotype once again comes from the older generation of Chinese immigrants because remember this, in the 50s and 60s in the US, everybody had a car. That was the American dream, everybody driving around in their gas-guzzling muscle cars. But China didn't have cars en masse until the early 2000s. So, teaching like a Chinese immigrant from that generation to drive is like teaching your grandma how to use an iPhone. It's not easy. Stereotype number 9, white worshipping. Chinese people have kind of a weird irony when it comes to how they perceive white people. You see, on one hand, there is a certain admiration and aspiration to be more like Europe and other Western countries. But I think it's not so much an appreciation for European culture necessarily. It's more that they admire Europe for how wealthy and affluent it is. Although I could be wrong, because there are whole cities in China that are modeled after Paris and other European cities. There's even a replica Eiffel Tower. So there's a general attitude amongst the working class in China that they must work hard to catch up to the West. You can see this attitude in the prevalence of white monkey jobs, which are basically when a company specifically goes out and looks for an attractive white person to work at their company and be the face of their company. They might work at the reception of a hotel, they might be the spokesperson for a product, or they literally just stand around and look pretty. Having a white person makes the establishment look a bit more upscale, and if you can't tell, anti-discrimination laws are pretty slack in China. So then the irony is that Chinese people are also a very collective and homogenous culture, and tend to reject foreigners. And you can see this attitude in the way we refer to anyone who is non-Chinese. We use the word 老外 or 外国人. It literally just means foreigner, but here's the thing. You could have lived in China your whole life, speak Chinese perfectly, and if you don't look Chinese, you are still 老外. And honestly, even Chinese people outside of China, like me, will sometimes refer to non-Chinese people as 老外. And you can definitely see that 这一点就是有点矛盾嘛，因为其实我们在当地我们才是外国人，还叫人家什么外国人。So in general, while there can be an attitude of looking up to white people and Western civilization, Chinese people are also very nationalistic and tend to keep to themselves. And even this idea of catching up to the West, which I talked about earlier, has been diminishing in recent years because China has made a lot of technological advancements in recent years. So, you could argue that China has already caught up to the West or even surpassed it in many fields. Stereotype number 10, Tiger Mom. If you're not familiar with this term, let me explain. The term Tiger Mom was coined in 2011 by Yale professor Amy Chua, and it refers to a Chinese mom with a very strict parenting style, who will force her kids to study harder, achieve more, and is willing to sacrifice her children's temporary happiness for long-term academic and career success, which they think will be for the better in the long run. And my response to this stereotype is, it's 100% true. I mean, sure, maybe there's a Chinese parent who's very relaxed and easygoing, but in general, on average, Chinese parents are way more strict and way more demanding than American parents, for example. This is almost certainly a big factor into why Chinese students seem to have a higher level of academic achievement, but it's also why Chinese students have higher levels of academic-related stress and sometimes even mental health issues. So let me kind of share my personal experiences and thoughts on this. My parents are kind of like Americanized Chinese because they're pretty supportive of us, regardless of what we do. For example, they clearly expressed that they think an ideal career for me would be a doctor, a professor, or an engineer. But when I said I wanted to study music, they still ended up letting me do that. But when we were young, my mom always made it very clear to us that we had to study hard. We had to try our best to be the best that we can be. And if we fell short of that mark, 那我们就对不起自己，我们就对不起家人. This is like the authentic version of dishonor on your family, dishonor on your cow.
Dishonor on you, dishonor on your cow.
One of her favorite sayings was 山外有山，楼外有楼. And it just means that there's always somebody who's better than you. And the takeaway, of course, is that you have to keep striving, you have to push yourself to the max, and you can't be complacent. And finally, as for punishment, Of course, the preferred Asian punishment is spanking with whatever object you have on hand. Not like the American kids, they just get grounded for a week. Like, is that even a punishment? So light. We've been grounded for most of 2020. So I'm kind of torn on this style of parenting, right? Because on one hand, I think it has created a lot of positive traits in me. I think it's the reason why I have higher aspirations, I am tougher mentally, and stronger willpower. People who know me know that I have a high standard for my work, and I fear nothing. So how can I replicate the positive results of this style of harsh parenting without going through the negative side effects? That's something I'm still trying to figure out, and thankfully I still have some time to do that. And that concludes 10 Chinese stereotypes. Hopefully you found it interesting and hopefully you learned something new. If you still have questions, feel free to leave it in the comments down below and I'd be happy to have a discussion with you. That is all for now. Stay safe and be kind. I'll see you guys in the next one. 我们下次再见了，拜拜。